reading the paper, I began to learn different kinds of things. And I also learned that the Body Politic and the Gay Alliance Towards Equality had just opened a storefront on Carlton Street, which wasn't far from where I was staying. And I was thinking of walking past on my way home when I saw on page 7 an article about Chilean fascists terrorizing gays, and I was stunned. Someone in Canada actually knew about what had just happened in Chile. Chile had been the great beacon of hope for Latin America when the socialist government of Salvador Allende was elected in 1970. And I'd been in Peru heading south when the coup happened in September 73. I heard Allende's last broadcast over the crackling radio in a cafe in Cusco. Minutes later, he was murdered by Pinochet's soldiers as the Air Force bombarded the presidential palace. I managed to cross the border into Chile a few months later when things had settled down. I saw the ruins of the palace, and there was still a dusk to dawn curfew. At night I heard shooting outside my cheap hotel room in Santiago. People I talked to were terrified, if they would talk at all, and there were armed soldiers everywhere. But when I returned to Canada, nobody seemed to know or care. It was just another coup in some far-off banana republic. But the Body Politic was covering it. They cared, and it was affecting gays. Then at the bottom of the same page, my eyes fell on the ad for an Ontario Gay Pride March. Reading the paper had gotten me used to the term gay. It no longer made my stomach twist like homosexual, but I didn't actually know any gay people. There were ads for bars and baths in the paper, but the thought of going to a gay bar conjured up terrifying images of drag queens or leathermen, and I had no idea what a bath was. But I'd been to my share of marches and demonstrations, and I knew what you were supposed to do at that kind of thing. Still, that hot Saturday afternoon in Allen Gardens, I hung around at a distance for a while before moving closer. None of the folks who were gathering were wearing drag or leather or chains. In fact, most of them seemed relatively normal. I didn't hear any of the sinister music that always came on when a homosexual appeared in the movies. So when they were almost ready to go, I quickly walked over and picked up a sign that said "Gay Liberation Now" and started marching down the sidewalk thinking, if there's a TV camera, I wonder if I can induce a heart attack and die by holding my breath. But there were no TV cameras. 50 people walking down the sidewalk with hand-drawn placards was hardly newsworthy even in 1974. Another advantage of there being only 50 people was that I was recognized as a new face in the crowd. When the march was over, I was snapped up, taken home, had sex with for the first time, given a bunch of gay liberation literature, and told to come back for more when I had finished reading. I was a quick reader. So we'll jump ahead a little bit. It starts off a few months later, and the months later is about the Damien case. Damien was a racing steward in Toronto who got fired because the racing commission found out that he was gay, and he was really the first. His was really the first major gay rights legal case, and it didn't work very well, right? A few months later, a second case surfaced. Doug Wilson was a true gay liberation poster boy. His flawless face, long blonde hair, and open farm boy looks graced the front cover of the Body Politic issue 21. Wilson had grown up in rural Saskatchewan. He was a master's student in the University of Saskatchewan's College of Education when, in September '75, he posted an ad in the student newspaper about forming a campus gay group. When the ad came to the attention of the university administration, he was called into the dean's office and informed that public identification with the gay movement was, quote, damaging to the college, and that he could no longer supervise in-classroom practicums of student teachers. Wilson went public and immediately received support from the university's student unions. The committee to defend Doug Wilson was successful in having the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission investigate. It was the first time that a provincial commission had agreed to accept a gay rights case. But the university managed to get an injunction to stop the commission's investigation on the grounds that sex did not include sexual orientation. The university won the battle, but it had already lost the war. Unlike the Damien Committee, which found itself locked into a legal process, the committee to defend Doug Wilson wisely did not pursue the legal route to challenge the injunction. It built horizontal alliances, garnering support from labor, women's, and social movement groups. Overnight, Wilson became a media celebrity. The growth in the Saskatchewan movement was exponential, and in March 1976, the university was forced to include sexual orientation in its anti-discrimination policy. The cases were quite different. Damien was middle-aged and had lost his livelihood. Although the case was significant for the community, it was still very much about achieving individual justice. As a young man, Wilson was less concerned about his own career. He dropped out of the master's program and turned his notoriety into the service of grassroots activism. Wilson corresponded with isolated gay people in rural areas for whom he was the first public gay figure in the province. He joined the board of directors and ultimately became executive director of the Saskatchewan Association on Human Rights and helped found both the Saskatchewan Gay Coalition with its innovative rural outreach program and the Metamorphosis Cultural Festival. That was. Hope it wasn't one of the ones I had to read. The spring of 1989, AIDS Action Now's focus was on the upcoming 5th International AIDS Conference to be held in Montreal. In March, I went on a reconnaissance mission to contact local activists. My timing was bad. 2 days before I arrived, Joe Rose, a young gay man living with AIDS, was queer-bashed and murdered on the Montreal transit system. Rose's death helped spark the formation of Réaction Sida, Montreal's first AIDS activist group, a few weeks after I left. When I visited the main service organization, Comité Sida Aide Montréal, in search of activists, they couldn't help me. They didn't get involved in politics. But they did put me in touch with one young man, Kevin, a former hustler who had become a patient advocate, complaining about shoddy hospital care. He wasn't connected to any organization and had little political analysis, but had a deep experiential knowledge about local problems for people living with AIDS in the healthcare system. At one point, he looked straight at me and said something I never forgot. AIDS is like a lens. When you look through it, you see all the problems of society, magnified many times. I also met Montreal councillor Raymond Blain, who in 1986 had been the first openly gay candidate to be elected in Canada. After swearing me to secrecy, he managed to get me a floor plan of the convention center where the conference would be held. That was worth its weight in gold, and we shared it with ACT UP in New York. We were already corresponding with Herb Spires at ACT UP. Together we developed Le Manifeste de Montréal, the Montreal Manifesto, a declaration of the universal rights and needs of people living with HIV. A few weeks before the conference, Réaction Sida found some unused office space to serve as a media center and organizing hub. ACT UP chartered a bus to bring up New York activists. Previously, international AIDS conferences had been about medical research and marketing opportunities for big pharma. People with AIDS, when we appeared at all, were little more than medical exhibits or faceless statistics. AIDS activists were determined that this was going to change. As the ACT UP people arrived from New York, the meetings in the activist center began to swell and go late into the night. We plotted out a week-long plan. There would be a unified demonstration outside the convention center as delegates arrived for the opening on Sunday, June 4th. Tuesday would focus on the struggle for anonymous testing. Wednesday was about lesbians and sex workers. Thursday, a rally with international speakers. And Friday would deal with Quebec issues and actions at the closing ceremonies. The office was filled up with people lining up to type and copy press releases and flyers while others painted banners on the floor. The phones and fax machines were buzzing. Many of us, including me, had not been able to afford the $500 registration fee, but someone had located a color Xerox and several ACT UP members were busy forging passes. I was to speak for AIDS Action Now at the first rally. As the delegates streamed in for the opening ceremony, activists gathered outside the main entrance. But ACT UP had something more dramatic up its sleeve. As I climbed on the makeshift podium, I realized there was a commotion at the entrance behind me. A flying squad of ACT UP members had just rushed the main doors and pushed past security. The rest of the ACT UP crowd was close behind. AIDS Action Now member Glenn Brown, head marshal for the rally, was standing beside me. He remembers that he asked me what we should do, and I replied, I guess we should lead them, so we followed with everyone else. Seconds later, 300 of us were streaming up the escalators to the main hall. Delegates were settling into their seats to hear opening remarks by Prime Minister Mulroney and Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda. Instead, they witnessed a crowd of activists roll onto the stage carrying banners and signs, many of which had been prepared by John Grayson as props for his video, "The World is Sick. Life Imitates Art." Once on stage, facing 12,000 startled delegates, no one quite knew what to do. Since I was chair of the main Canadian organization, someone stuck a mic in front of my face. The address that I had planned outside hardly seemed appropriate. This was the time for sound bites, so I opened the conference, quote, "on behalf of people living with AIDS," and launched into an attack on the hypocrisy of the Mulroney government, my 15 seconds of international fame. After a few more speeches, there was confusion about how long we were going to stay. The conference was now well behind schedule. The Canadians left first. An ACT UP spokesperson read the Montreal Manifesto in French and English, and finally, despite protests from security, everyone settled into the empty VIP seats in the front of the hall. The significance of that moment was captured in the ACT UP account of the event. Quote, "But it was only when we refused to leave the auditorium and instead parked ourselves in the VIP section that the crowd realized that our action was more than just a symbolic protest. Despite threats and rumors of a potential international incident, we remained in our seats, alternately chanting and cheering and giving notice that people living with AIDS were inside the conference to stay. From that point on, in the crisis, researchers would have to make extra room at the table for PWAs and their advocates." Aboriginal lesbians and gay men were also a growing presence in Toronto, as more Aboriginal people began moving to the cities. Art Sokole came to Toronto in 1979 from Lac des Mille Lacs, First Nations near Thunder Bay. He remembers that at first, Aboriginal gay men would see each other in a bar, but we wouldn't talk to each other. But by the late 1980s, friendship networks were developing, and we noticed that people had started getting sick. Sokole explains, "So our humble beginnings were taking care of our friends and going into people's homes as care teams. Then they would pass away and we'd have all kinds of issues. Some communities wouldn't even accept the body back home because of the stigma around AIDS. We realized that we needed to do our own ceremonies. We realized that we came from a place where we had a lot of our culture with us. We started our own celebrations of life, introduced our ceremonies into those, and had them at the Native Canadian Centre. In 1988, Sokole and Billy Morasti put up posters in the bars and booked a small room at the 519 Church Street Centre for a community meeting. 35 people came. A consensus emerged on the need for an ongoing group. Since there were participants from several nations, everyone had a different term to refer to people like themselves in their own language. So they agreed on an English name, Gays and Lesbians of the First Nations in Toronto. Sokole recalls at the time, when it came to lesbians, he had no idea. In fact, at the first meeting, he was startled to see Laverne Monette, a lawyer for the Union of Ontario Indians. He thought to himself, "Oh my God, the Union of Ontario Indians has sent their lawyer to see what we're doing." But as the meeting went on, it dawned on him just as suddenly, "Oh my God, she's a lesbian." Nonetheless, women came to play a strong role in the group. Its first executive director was Susan Beaver. Some funding was secured from the City of Toronto. Then in 1991, Frank McGee from the newly formed Provincial AIDS Bureau offered the group $50,000 to do AIDS work with the Aboriginal community. That sparked the need for incorporation, eventually under the name Two-Spirited People of the First Nations. It was ironic that it took AIDS to generate a funded, stable, institutional presence for racialized and Indigenous people within Toronto's LGBT communities. It was this engagement with the state that amplified such voices within the community as a whole. But while these groups were often involved in anti-homophobia work in their communities as part of their AIDS education mandate, their work was usually defined as prevention and support. AIDS Action Now continued to be the only group with a clear mandate on advocacy and activism around treatment issues. Okay, and we'll do one more. As the marriage issue gained momentum, it began to swamp Egal's legal committee. For members such as Hilary Cook, it seemed like other issues were being neglected. According to Cook, who took over as chair of the remaining legal committee, marriage was like a train leaving the station. You were on the train or not, and we had to be on it. It was going. I remember being slightly bemused by these developments. People did all sorts of foolish things, and I suppose that there was no reason why getting married shouldn't be one of them. Certainly Richard and I, by then together for almost 30 years, didn't need no piece of paper from the City Hall, as Joni Mitchell sang, to authorize our relationship. Others were not so liberal in their response. The relationship between Egal and Extra is the major Toronto paper, had been growing increasingly testy since 1999, when Brenda Costner, associate professor at the University of Toronto's law faculty, published a column entitled "No Sex Please, National Lobby Group Stands Up for Respectable Rights Only." While crediting Egal for its intervention in spousal rights cases, she also pointed out that the organization had been conspicuously absent from the issues such as age of consent and censorship of sexually explicit material. With marriage now squarely on the table, things heated up. In April 2001, Extra published a piece on Jane Rule's opposition to marriage. Rule, the groundbreaking lesbian author who had stuck with the body politic through thick and thin in the 80s, told Extra, "Over the years when we have been left to live lawless, a great many of us have learned to take responsibility for ourselves and each other, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, not bound by the marriage service or model, but singularities and groupings of our own invention. To be forced back into the heterosexual cage of coupledom is not a step forward, but a step back into state-imposed definitions of relationship. With all that we have learned, we should be helping our heterosexual brothers and sisters out of their state-defined prisons, not volunteering to join them there." Even the recognition of common-law spouses hurt the most vulnerable, she said. Whether they want it or not, any couple must now declare themselves if they've been together for a year. Single moms and those with disabilities will have to choose whether to live alone or surrender government benefits if they have a working partner. The next month, Extra publisher David Wahlberg penned "Mad Vow Disease." "I'm surprised divorcing couples don't plead temporary insanity at the time of their wedding. Love has often been compared to madness, and who but a complete Looney Tune would at 25 vow publicly that they'll still be supporting someone 50 years hence? Yes, it's mad vow disease. Surely those unspeakably garish bridesmaid outfits could be offered as evidence." In September, Garth Kirby, managing editor of Extra, wrote, No to marriage rights. He said, "I hope they lose the legal fight for marriage equality rights." Nevertheless, when the Ontario cases got to the Ontario Superior Court in July 2002, 3 judges unanimously found that defining marriage in opposite-sex terms violated the Charter. It gave the government 2 years to rectify the situation. Despite the sometimes barbed back and forth between Extra and Egal over marriage, once the path was clear, hundreds of lesbian and gay men started lining up to register. For a moment, Toronto became the gay marriage capital of North America. People were voting with their feet. Many, it turned out, just wanted to be included. The court decision was a sign of the huge cultural shift that had taken place, a testament to all our work. But there had also been a shift in the goals of lesbian and gay activism. If, in the 1970s, anyone in the body politic had suggested demanding the right to marry, they would have been run out of town. Okay. Yeah, so that's kind of a dry history. I tried to make it not a dry history. And it does focus on Toronto, and so, it's Toronto-centric, but it sort of takes Toronto as a case study for what happened. The problem with Canada, of course, is there's so many different things going on in different ways in different parts, and if you try to put them all together, it's hard to produce a narrative out of it. So I thought, okay, I'll focus on what I know. It'll be about Toronto, and hopefully there'll be some things useful for people in other places. So, questions, comments, disagreements? Yes.
I'd like to hear you say some more about some of the themes that run through this story, particularly
Sure. I hadn't realized it at the time, but when I started doing the research, I had to read like all the body politics, like 16 years of body politics, like over again, right? Which was very enlightening because you were making it and you read the issue and then it was gone. And I looked at that first group of people that I had joined around the paper in 1974 and realized that we were all from working class backgrounds and the first in our families ever to get into post-secondary education. And that was like, look at that. Like, what's going on here, right? And that was really only possible because of that Keynesian welfare state, because in the 1970s, university was almost free, right? I mean, I think I had a $200 student loan and a $500 grant to go to Carleton when I went to Carleton in '69. So there was this period of like upward mobility going on. And the other thing that was happening was that Keynesian state also supported our activism. The body politic, I mean, it was an all volunteer thing, right? There were paid staff who got minimum wage, one paid staff legally. But what actually happened was we had two, which is twice as many, because the person who was working would work long enough to qualify for unemployment insurance. Then we would lay them off and hire somebody else who would work long enough to qualify for unemployment insurance. And then we would lay them off and hire the first person again, right? So we were able to, double the number of people in staff because we had access to an unemployment insurance system that actually worked. Unlike the one we have today that wouldn't support anything anywhere, right? So I really began to think about the class character of that early movement, and then began to think about the major fights and contradictions. And there were two sets. One was between the bar and bath owners, like the gay petty bourgeoisie, if you want to call it that, and this new radical working class movement, right, who wanted to like change everything. And the other was between men and women. Now both of these, in the first case, both the bar and bath owners and the young radicals were attempting to speak for and mobilize this vast majority of people who were deeply in the closet because there's no human rights protection. You're absolutely crazy to come out, right? You could, Damien lost his job, Doug Wilson lost his career as a teacher, all those kinds of things would happen. So most people were like under the radar, right? It was like the social contract of the closet, if you don't stick up too far, we don't arrest you or beat you up or, murder you or whatever, right? That's the way it worked. So both of us were trying to speak for that group. And the bar and bath owners who were more established and didn't want to rock the boat and had connections, wanted to do vertical alliances. They knew politicians who they could talk to, and maybe they would help out, right? Whereas the young radicals wanted to do horizontal alliances. It's the women's movement, it's the anti-war movement, it's all of these other kinds of movements that we need to be building our strength. And you can see that a little bit in the Wilson John Damien difference, right? And the other thing between men and women, it suddenly occurred to me that even though the 1970s were a much more socially equal period than we have today, like the stats in 1970, 66% of people in Toronto lived in middle-income areas. Right? It didn't mean that they were middle class. It meant that they were working class people with decent jobs and pensions and all that kind of stuff, and they could afford to live in middle-income areas. Now, more than 50% of Toronto's population lives in below-average income areas. Right? It's just like the divide is just like amazing. But in the 70s, women earned about 60 cents for every dollar men earned. So if you were a young gay man, you were benefiting from a male wage. But if you were a dyke who didn't have a man to support her, right, or were trying to raise kids with another dyke, you were living on about half that much. And so there's like not just a gender difference between the gay men and the lesbians, there's a class difference as well, right? Because the more middle class or more professional lesbians, like the more middle class and professional gay men, didn't come out because they would lose everything. And so I began to see, like, class really affects the way these things were playing out. And, the politics are, that's sort of how would you say, the under layer of the politics. The politics are much more complicated and entangled, but you could see how that's kind of shaping stuff. Tom Warner, in his book, noticed it, that when, by the 90s, in the fight around, not around equal marriage yet, but around spousal benefits, suddenly getting spousal benefits got on the radar. And he was with, the organization in Ontario was CLGRO, the Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Rights in Ontario, which had been made up of those kind of early activists, now a little bit older and a little bit more established, but still that same cohort. But as they got into the spousal benefit stuff, he noticed that a whole new group of people started coming to meetings and in fact ended up dominating the organization. And these were professional people with benefits at work, right? Like good jobs, all of that kind of stuff, who really stood to gain from getting same-sex spousal benefits recognized. Whereas if you were like a waiter or one of those other kinds of jobs, you didn't have any benefits. So like it was theoretically nice, but it didn't really mean anything to you. And so you could see a shift in the class character of who was dominating the movement. The other thing that happened was that in those early cases, we were forced into the courts. Right, in the Damien case, where we took that on, big mistake, right? But around the body politic trials, when they accused us of indecent and scurrilous material, or the bath raids, right? We had to fight in the courts, otherwise we were going to jail, right? And we won. And so this idea was that, well, maybe we should be focusing more on courts as a means of redress for this kind of thing. And if the courts are your focus, of course, lawyers set the strategy. And who are lawyers, right? And if in the early days you were considered important if you could bring lots of people out to the demonstrations, or you knew people in other oppressed communities, now you were important if you knew people who could make lots of money, right? So once again, the class character begins to change. And as that change comes, two things happen. One is that those strategies for vertical alliances, for connecting with officials and people in power and getting them on your side becomes more important. But it also means that as you get a little bit of progress, then those people who originally would have never come out of the closet because they had too much to lose, now are protected, and therefore they could come out. And so once again, that begins to change the class character and the politics of the movement. And so the marriage thing is almost completely symbolic, right? But it's about respectability, and that's what this new cohort wants. Even though even in the spousal benefits thing, as Jane Rule pointed out, for some people, if you were on welfare, and at AIDS Action Now, in those days, like, we were very ambivalent about the whole spousal benefit stuff, because we knew lots and lots of people who could get a drug card because they were on welfare, were going to die without that drug card, but did have a partner, and all of a sudden this partner was recognized, they were going to lose all those benefits. And so it was like healthcare was going to disappear out from under people so that other people would have, it was like a very contradictory thing going on here. And it's that kind of change that I think I'm trying to chronicle here, and how that when people who really have a stake in the system run the movement, then there's this kind of symbiosis between the movement and the state. And suddenly, the state protects us, and we support the state. And so, taking us back to Toronto, where 50% of the population is now in below average income areas, for Pride last year, Black Lives Matter, people know, right? For lots of relatively well-off gay men and lesbians, having the police in the parade is a symbol of progress. It's, you know, these are the guys who used to beat the shit out of us all the time, and now they're like showing their support. But if you're a young black queer from the suburbs who's still being carded, who's still being hassled, still being beaten up, maybe shot, right, by the cops, these troops of uniformed police in this parade sends a clear message like, I don't really belong here, right? Who are these people, right? What are they celebrating? And so then you get Black Lives Matter saying cops out of the parade and other people freaking out, I mean, how can you do this? And, you know, so these contradictions in the community, which used to be held together by the glue of sexual orientation, because we were all very much in the same boat, now that glue doesn't hold us together anymore because we're in different boats. Right? Some of us have access to all this progress, and others feel that life is much the same as it's always been, if not worse. Sorry, that's the long answer.
Very good.
Let me shift my, so I can actually see you again. Yeah.
Just wondering, you mentioned about queers against Israeli apartheid.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering a couple of things. One, how you define apartheid when I'm looking at the state of Israel. Of course, homosexuality is legal in Israel. And you post 2 million Arab Israelis living in Israel, plus a whole host of other minor religious and other ethnicities. And for Arab Israelis, are represented and have access to every strata of society, including parliamentary representation. And also, it's not mandatory for them to serve the idea where it is mandatory for Jewish
In fact, they're discouraged from serving the idea.
citizens.
Yeah.
And in the territories under Palestinian Authority, of course, homosexuality is illegal, and no Jews are permitted to live. And when you're talking about ethnic cleansing of Arab Palestinians, then I have to juxtapose that against the ethnic cleansing all over the Middle East of Jews from lands where they had lived in for millennia, literally, especially post-1948. Jews aren't allowed to live in the Gulf states. Jews aren't allowed on some of the Arab airlines, i.e. Kuwaiti Airlines. So I guess I'd like to know how you define apartheid, especially with a country that supports gay rights vis-a-vis these other territories, which in so many ways are not disposed to the rights of other people, whether they're other religious rights or sexual expression, but also given the degree of oppression in the territories, Palestinian territories of their own people.
Okay, I'm glad at first that you recognize the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians as a problem, right?
Well, no, I haven't said that.
Oh, you did. You said it happened both. You said it juxtaposed it with, right?
From the book.
Yeah. I misunderstood that. I thought you just said that why do I talk about the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians when Jews were ethnically cleansed from Arab countries, which would seem to me that you're drawing a parallel, that ethnic cleansing took place in both.
Supposing the fact that there are Arab Palestinians living in Israel.
Okay. So in terms of Israel as an apartheid state, I would defer to the South Africans, because I think the South Africans probably know more about apartheid than anybody else. And in 2009, the Social Sciences and Humanities Council of South Africa, which is sort of like SHIRK here, but an organization that does its own research for the South African government, did a major study, because the question of Israel and apartheid had come up at Durban and all these other places. So they said, let's try to look at this and see, is it apartheid or not? What are the similarities and what are the differences? What they said was that you saw, first of all, real differences in rights. So looking at the people in the occupied territories, and we call it the occupied territories, even though it's now been basically controlled by Israel since 1967, which is a long time ago. It's de facto part of Israel, and as the settlements grow, it's more and more a de facto part of Israel. Those people have no benefits to any of these Israeli laws protecting gay people or anybody else. They live under military law. They have a pass system, like the caste system in South Africa. They live in particular areas, can't live in other areas. They have very curtailed rights. So that difference in legal rights is quite clear if you compare what happened in South Africa and what happened what's happening in Israel-Palestine now, that those differences in legal rights are very similar. First. Second, there is also huge inequality that stems from that. So if you look at, say for example, the amount spent per head per Arab child on education in Israel compared to what's spent for Jewish kids, it's almost the same as the difference between what was spent for black education and white education in South Africa in the 80s, right? And those stats come from the Israeli government, the Department of Education. They look at how much is spent. And thirdly, is that in the face of this legal injustice and social inequality, there is a militarized state in order to enforce that kind of injustice so that people look at a line. And we saw that in South Africa, and we see that today in Israel-Palestine. In fact, the whole West Bank is a military area. So that is not to say that it's exactly the same. No, there are certainly differences. People also don't remember South Africa very well anymore. For example, there were colored people in the South African Parliament. They had certain seats that they were allowed in the South African Parliament, so it wasn't complete. But in terms of residential segregation, in terms of social inequality, in terms of legal inequality, those two systems are very parallel. And the South Africans, at the conclusion of that research, which took several years and the usual social science stuff, concluded that it was completely legitimate to call Israel an apartheid state. So as I said, I would go with the South Africans on that. Okay, do we have a different question? Just to pass. Since the book, I think there's 10 pages in the book on Israel, right? So really, it's not about Israel. Yeah.
Do you think, in a sense, we've kind of reached the limits? I don't know how to word it, in case I'll just throw it out. We're talking about the rights that have been established that we've gained as a community, but the dynamics within the community have started changing, and specifically with the Black Lives Matter. Do you think as a movement, now we're going to start to splinter? Because now we have specific groups within the overall group saying we're not buying into the overall.
I think that's what we see happening right now, and that that it's not just splintering, but it's like how do we go forward, right? I mean, and what is forward? When we started, we were talking about a fundamental transformation in society. There was like the black liberation was going to deal with racism, women's liberation was going to deal with sexism, and gay liberation had the sex part, right? That was going to be our contribution. And this was not just tinkering with laws, right? It was changing society, not being included in society. Yet as that kind of transformation took place, we have, I think you're right, reached the limits of inclusion for those of us who are allowed to be included on other ways, right? So I don't have to worry about the cops anymore when I walk out late at night, where I can remember in the 70s that yes, you had to be very careful leaving the bars late at night, because if you got caught out alone, you could be taken down to Cherry Beach, and people don't know the geography of Toronto, but Cherry Beach was this kind of, it's on the waterfront, and in those days it was kind of an industrial area, there was no transit, it was like the middle of nowhere, and they would take you down there and beat you up, and then leave you there, and you'd have to walk back into the center of the city. Similar to what was happening in some places in the West around the Aboriginal people being dumped to the, right? That kind of stuff, yeah, that kind of thing. I don't worry about that anymore, right? But young black queers still do, right? Not maybe Cherry Beach, but they still worry. And so what what we need to begin to think about is, if we recognize that getting legal rights was one aspect of it, how do we continue a struggle for a more just society? Right? What does that look like? And what is the role that queers can play in that struggle? And who do we ally with now? Right? And maybe, maybe that's going to involve splintering. Black Lives Matter is a very interesting group in Toronto because it's a largely queer group, right? But their alliances are with black groups, right? That's the community that they see as the crucial community pushing things forward. What does it mean for others? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I said in this, in the end, right? Only an idiot attempts to predict the future, right? Especially in these changing days. But that if the Keynesian system was seen as being relatively stable, the neoliberal system that we're in now, with these huge class disparities between rich and poor, but bubbles and things in the economy, is notoriously unstable. And unstable economic systems produce unstable political systems, and unstable political systems tend to produce authoritarianism, i.e. south of the border, right? And I wrote that before that election, right? Just to say, before the election, right? And so, if that shift happens, what does that mean for even the rights that we have won, even for people like me, right? Do those things start getting rolled back? We've already seen some rolling back in terms of the transgender washroom stuff in the States. Just as important, I think, is suddenly abortion. Is those rights, which you thought Roe versus Wade, like a billion years ago, that was done, right? Suddenly, this is once again, right? And so, if that happens, what kind of alliance do we end up with, right? Do all queer people, gay people, have to get together again because all of a sudden we're all back in the same boat? That I don't know, right? I think what I'm trying to get at in this book is that what shaped the movement were these broader social and economic changes, and that we can predict that the future is going to be pretty sketchy, but exactly how it's going to be sketchy, I don't know. We're just going to have to play that one by ear, I think. But I think that is the crucial question. We assume homonationalism, okay, so this is maybe homonationalism was like the Weimar Republic, right? Maybe it was like a flash in the pan, and maybe we're in for something much more serious.
Yeah, I can remember when we met in Ottawa in 1969, there was a demonstration for choice, I remember, because it was on the sound truck trying to keep the sound system together. There was a demonstration there was a major gay demonstration that year. There was an Aboriginal demonstration. I can remember at Carleton, where we both were, asking Trudeau's dad, and he didn't have a good answer, what about the 70%, the fact that only about 70% as much, or it may have been less, I don't remember, is spent on the education of on an Aboriginal child as is spent on a white child? And many years later, we see that issue finally coming up in our own apartheid system here. I mean, it's interesting because all those movements arose around the same time. There were strong alliances, and of course, many of those are going in different directions now. So, I guess that's what your book is all about.
That's what my book is all about. Yeah. What else?
Well, what was also amazing was the tactics that you, I don't want to use the word got away with in Montreal, but in a way they were.
Yeah.
I was very active in the peace movement in Toronto, and I can remember I was talking about that day, April 23rd, 1983, biggest day of demonstration in many, many years. There must have been 100,000 across Canada, over 25,000 in Toronto. And that demonstration, due to internal divisions, Communist Party of Canada sabotaging it, didn't go down Yonge Street, which it intended to do. Later that night, a gay march of something like 100 people forced its way up Yonge Street. So, militancy, it does take militancy, it does seem to take confrontation, but you really have to choose where and when.
There is that, the other thing is also how, when you look back at that, how much times have changed. Security at the Montreal conference in '89 was like a few kind of elderly security guards who were, who had like a part-time job, right? They stand by the door, and all of a sudden, like 100 of these mostly young gay activists just like marched through, right? We did a thing in '93, trying to get the attention of the Minister of Health around AIDS meds, right? Because we were in this bizarre situation where we were getting some meds coming along, but people couldn't afford them, right? The only way you could get if you had a good job, right, then you get that on your insurance. But if you didn't have that kind of a job, if you were like the waiter, the actor, those kinds of stereotypical gay jobs, you didn't have that. And so the only way you could get a drug card to cover your drug costs was to go on welfare, which meant you had to give up work and impoverish yourself because you couldn't have any money in the bank or anything. So you had absolutely nothing. And then you get welfare, you could get a drug card, but then of course you couldn't afford to feed or clothe yourself, right? Which is, nutrition is kind of important when you've got a bad immune system. And so what we were pushing for was what we call a catastrophic drug program to ensure that anybody whose drug costs were going above what they could afford to pay were going to be covered. And of course, it was an NDP government at the time. And, they made all sorts of good sounds when they were running in the election, and of course, the story, right? Mm-hmm. So, at one point, we decided that, we kept asking for a meeting with the minister, and they were always too busy. And so we thought, okay, well, we're just going to have to go to her. And so, a bunch of us with chains and handcuffs and all these other accoutrements that you'd otherwise think of as sex toys, went over to Queen's Park, got on the elevator, went upstairs into the office of the Minister of Health, and handcuffed ourselves to all the furniture and said, we're not leaving until the minister meets us, right? And I always have to say this when I'm telling this story, is that if you're going to go this way, you're going to be excited, right? Don't put on the handcuffs too tight. Because it'll cut off the circulation and it's really uncomfortable, right? And if you take out the key to make it looser, then the theater is disrupted, right? The whole thing has got to be, yeah.
So, we in Canada right now are in the middle of refugee, on the edge of the receiving end of the refugee crisis. Yeah. And numbers of those people are not only leaving where they've been living because of conflict situations, but compounded that is that they are queer at one form or another. Yeah. And it sort of surprises me that there doesn't seem to be, the queer community in Canada doesn't seem to have stepped up to the plate in terms of sponsorship groups or that kind of thing. And so my question is there something in the way refugees are selected and allotted and privacy laws and stuff that this isn't going to come out? Or has society moved past that so it just doesn't matter anymore? Take on that.
Yeah. Well, in fact, some people have stepped up to the plate, but it tends to be local, so I don't know if you hear about it nationally. Mm-hmm. So there's a group called the Rainbow Railroad, right? And their mandate, they get people here. That's basically all they do, right? Once people are here, like, you're on your own, friend, right? So on the one hand, it's important because they're getting people out of Turkey and different places, which is quite important. But a number of groups have set up. You can now sponsor a refugee if you get a group together, and therefore you can cover their expenses and things. And MCC in Toronto has spun off several of these groups and are bringing in people, and then provide them with support for a couple of years, housing and helping them find jobs and all that kind of stuff. So there is stuff being done on a local basis. And Toronto is one of the major refugee reception areas, not by any means the only one. I don't know what's happening in other places, But certainly the models are there, and the way that the refugee system is now set up, it is in fact open to community support of queer refugees. And as you say, there's a real dire need for that right now, because people are finding themselves in like really awful situations. So it is possible and it is happening, but I think it hasn't generalized as much as it possibly could.
Yeah, and I think the other barrier is if you do manage to come over from,
Wherever.
pick out of the air to
Yeah.
Sudan,
Yeah.
the Sudanese community here is not likely to be any more accepting of you than they were when you were living
Yeah.
whatever that country is. So those supports aren't
Yeah.
as easily obtainable.
No, you're absolutely right.
I do remember talking to one woman, this was in Victoria, and she said they didn't, I don't know if their family fell through or they didn't have enough money to support a full family. And they said, well, why don't we support a gay person and we'll approach the powers that be? And they said, oh, well, we can't tell you anybody that we get, right? So,
yeah, a lot of those communities. I mean, think it took 40 years to actually change the culture in Canada, right? And I tried to make sense of that process on the conditions that made that process actually possible. In lots of parts of the world, that process had never happened, right? So those cultures have never changed, right? I think that there's often a stereotype. It's often exaggerated just how homophobic these others might be, because there's always spaces where people move and maneuver and are accepted. I was talking to some Jamaican friends, because the situation in Jamaica can be quite dire, and people saying, well, especially in the villages, there'll be the queer in town. He'll be our queer. So he doesn't, we don't hassle him. But anybody else that we see as queer, they get it, right? And so it's in the larger cities where like all these neighborhoods are divided up that you get this kind of really horrible stuff happening. One of the interesting things is that as people do come here, and as people in their communities come out, then that in fact is trickling back to the home countries again. Right, because those conversations are now become international. So, there's all sorts of difficulties sometimes with Canadian do-gooders going off to save people in these benighted parts of the world, to rescue them, just like missionaries went off to rescue women, or all those kinds of things. But there's also kind of within those communities conversations. So I just got back from India a couple of weeks ago, where my partner was showing his film at the Bangalore Queer Film Festival, and when they heard I was there, they said, well, can you do a book talk? And so I said, sure, except the book isn't available in India, and this is about Toronto, and is this going to make sense to you guys? And it was a really interesting conversation. A lot of the people who are in this new movement in India have connections with people in the diaspora. And one of the things that the guy who was a very prickly guy, who was kind of my discussant, said, he said, and he wasn't prickly at me so much as the Indians. He was always complaining about the Indians. He said, if you read this book, you'll see that in North America there was 40 years of fights and struggles, and they moved from gay to queer, whereas in India we started with queer, right? And there's none of this foundation. And at the same time, whereas we had a notion of sexual identity, like a gay, straight, binary, if you look at Indian sexual identities, it's there's all these gods that are changing sexes, and there's hijras, and there's it's a million different ways of expressing what we could generally call queerness, right? Traditionally. And so how do you build on that, right? How do you connect that? So what they're really struggling with is how do they benefit from the kinds of experiences that we've had here, but also how do we make sure that what we're doing is actually based in our own reality and not trying to push somebody else's model that doesn't really ever fit, right? And that becomes a serious issue. I mean, in terms of the, probably one of the most egregious homonationalist things, and like how do you figure it out, is that the Harper government, which was like really bad on refugees, and it's like managed to stop so many refugees from coming, actually had a special program to allow Iranian queer refugees to come in, right? Because they didn't like Iran, right? And so every time they, it was like poke at Iran all the time, right? And so on the one hand, yes, being queer in Iran is no piece of cake, right? And a lot of people have to get out. And so absolutely it's good that they are able to come to a safe place. But on the other hand, you see yourself being used in this way for geopolitics that really has nothing to do with the issue, right? And so, like, what's the progressive position on that? Like, how do you begin to unravel that? It's complicated, right? And I don't think I got the answers, but I think we really need to look at those broader social things because it gives us some idea of the depth and nature of the problem. Yeah.
Just one of the earlier excerpts you read from your book, it wasn't clear to me. The change within the gay community with respect to the attitude of marriage, I mean, for the gay community.
Yeah.
Because some of the readings from earlier seem to issue it as an antiquated institution that isn't needed. Like, is it tied to economic conditions? Is it tied to having acquiring benefits? How important is marriage in the gay community per se, your own section?
I think that, despite that kind of anti-marriage stuff that we heard about at the time, generally people have embraced marriage. And I'm as an old dinosaur, I'm constantly, and I see these kind of young, hip, edgy, radical people, and they introduce me to their husband. I'm like, what? And they're, he's a boy, right? And just in parenthesis, how come all the lesbians have wives and the gay men have husbands? Like, how do we gender this, right? I mean, what's going on here? Anyway, but that's sort of beside the point. So I think there has been that general acceptance of marriage as an institution, but it has to do with the fact that, it's the same thing around feminism, right? That feminists, once saw marriage as like a real problem, and now we talk about, equal marriages. Right? And so, is that forward moving or is that slipping back? I mean, it's once again, it's really complicated. Not all people want to get married, and somebody says in my partner's video, marriage is a word that everybody recognizes. When you say that you're married, they understand that this is an important relationship to you. That doesn't mean that we have to confine ourselves to heterosexual models of marriage. That's between us, and we do that in our own way. So think of it as a kind of a pedagogy, right? So, yeah.
So there's a lot of diversity within.
There's a lot of diversity, I think, in the community. But I think the majority of people are like more and more accepting of it. Yeah.
Yeah, on the subject of marriage, it's way more complicated than that because, like, Aaron and I were both feminists, and when it became legal to be married, we didn't rush to it, but we made that decision, and a big part of that had to do with healthcare issues. And because, on paper in Saskatchewan, as a common law couple, you don't have to declare yourself, just that you are. As a gay couples, as straight couples, you have certain rights, the same rights as married people in terms of access or making decisions about your partner who's very ill. And but in the hospital, when it comes to reality, it doesn't work that way.
No.
If you're married, that's different.
Yeah.
Like, just a year ago, we had friends who she was told, no, it doesn't matter, you have to be married if you're going to have any say or any knowledge about your partner. where's your marriage certificate? And of course, unfortunately, that's from an immigrant doctor from a country that's not North America or Europe. So their own personal prejudices are coming in there. So you're in a situation where it's very upsetting. You're not in a position where you're willing to march down to the patient advocate and say, I have a rights here.
Yeah.
You're not in that space.
Yeah.
So the decisions to get married are very different.
Yeah.
But one of my conditions when I agreed to marry Erin was that she never called me her wife.
No.
But, I
We're
mean,
both totally against husband and wife.
Yeah.
And
We don't
that's a strong
understand.
feminist principle,
Yeah.
but we
Never.
don't understand, it's true that the
Younger people seem to be quite comfortable.
comfortable with that, and we're not. So it's a complicated thing.
Yeah, it's good.
And I think our experience in the gay lesbian movement in Saskatchewan is different than Toronto. It'd be interesting to do some look at that.
Mhm.
But we there was no way that you could be part of a group that had completely your ideas, like to be
Mhm.
part of a gay group that supported the Palestinians, for example, is just a no-go.
Yeah.
Because there's not enough of us.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not
yeah,
that
yeah.
there aren't people that have opinions like who are gay who don't support, that have those views. So our people, so now we're in an interesting position as retired people of socializing with queer people who, like we were as out and took the flack, and now you're socializing with other retired queer people, and that they're busy telling you, well, I couldn't come out because I didn't have tenure, or I couldn't come out because of this and because of that, or my sister couldn't come out because she couldn't have her partner under her health plan because that means that she'd have to tell some. Oh, sorry, I was doing that. Like we did that so probably in a big city you don't even have to talk to those people.
Oh, you'd be surprised, yeah. And I like to talk to those people, right? I mean, really, because it's like, that is one of the interesting things about the gay community and gay men especially, right? Because you end up talking to all sorts of people who, like, in terms of age and where they're from and culture and class and like. Normally you would never meet, but certainly, I don't do the grinder stuff. I'm sorry, I think that's bad, but I still go to the baths, right? And it's just amazing all the people you end up kind of, I'm a sociologist, so I get to like talk to all these people and ask them about their lives, and it's like, wow, like where else? So yeah, but you're absolutely right. The marriage thing is, it's very complicated. And I myself and my partner have never felt the need to get married, but I know other people for immigration purposes or for this purpose or that purpose. Yeah, it makes sense, right? If you don't do it, then you're gonna really suffer, and why set yourself up for that?
Well, the other things about marriage is it's the whole property thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like not necessarily that you have enough stuff of value, but you see people who lose 30 years worth of living together because there's nothing written on paper. And coming from a fundamentalist family, if ever I was partnered, I probably would choose to be married partly to protect my partner if I passed away first.
Either get married or have a very good will.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
That's the other thing, right? And you can bypass it that way, but marriage makes it automatic. You don't even need the damn will, right?
That's it. That's it.
Okay.
I just
Yeah,
have one question.
yeah, of course.
It may be in your book, but how did the Canadian movement mirror other countries? That
Yeah.
Was this the beginning? Did other countries model us, or did we model others?
That first movement tended to be international in terms of kind of
After Stonewall.
after Stonewall, kind of across the Atlantic, right? So, I mean, one of the things I did for the Body Politic for many, many years was to do the international news. That was sort of my job on the collective. And so once a month I would have to read all of the lesbian and gay newspapers from around the world, which wasn't that hard, right? Because there weren't that many of them, right? So there would be lots from the States. So the movement here kind of mirrored a lot of what was going on in the States and learned from what was going on in the States. But there was also stuff in the UK. France had a movement. The Netherlands, the German movement. I mean, Germany had a movement in the 1860s or 70s, right? And we got wiped out in the Holocaust, but reformed itself again in the 70s after Stonewall. The Swedes, but that was just about it, right? So since then, other countries have picked up. Australia too, sort of the kind of other southern states like Australia. So in terms of legal changes, we in fact have been more successful than the United States. We have leaped ahead. If that's your only measure, then yeah, I mean, we got marriage, and they're still fighting about decriminalization in certain states, and so it's been we've been much more successful there to that extent. The Americans were very interested in the fights in Canada around gay marriage because they wanted a precedent north of the border, right? And so they actually did some kind of consultation and stuff. It's in the book around GAL and their strategy. Not always the best strategy, maybe, but they were involved in that. But other countries have taken their own path. And India has followed the path to try to get decriminalization, because that seems to be like